Welcome to a new Daily Top Askreddit video. Today's topic. Serious, teachers of Reddit, when have you met the parents of a student and suddenly understood their behavior? Attention. Serious, tag notice. Jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted in any comment, parent or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing a NOMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please contact the moderators of this subreddit if you have any questions or concerns. Here's a lighter one. I had a student who always left their homework at school, always left their report at school, always left letters at school. I assumed it was all accidental to avoid their parents knowing about school things. Then we had parents' evening, and I had a lovely conversation with their mum. Mum asked for a particular sheet of information, and made notes on it. Then she got up and left, and I realized she'd left the sheet behind on the desk just like her child always did. This happens frequently. The most common are those students whose parents are terribly overprotective and defensive. These students are overwhelmingly likely to be either arrogant, lazy types used to being bailed out, or anxious, quiet things terrified of disappointing their parents. But one parent in particular sticks in my mind. He was a really soft-spoken, kind chap, and totally blind from birth. His daughter walked him up to my desk where we talked for ages. He was appreciative of my time and feedback about his child, and spoke very fondly of her. Then gently led him away to the next appointment, chatting away together. It made sense because this student was simply delightful in class, enthusiastic, kind and deeply empathetic towards others. She had time for everyone. I couldn't help thinking I'd just seen a fantastic relationship between a parent and child that had just been productive in every way. It cheered me up no end. I had this student who was so down on himself. His intuition for math was great and he would understand everything in class, but then there was no follow-through. No effort on homework or anything. At parent-teacher conferences he had almost failed my class, but I let him do makeup work and he just barely made it. I spoke to him in front of his father and I said, "I think he can do better than this." The father looked at him and said, "I don't think he can, I think this is your best." I'm not supposed to contradict parents, but I said, "I think he will prove you wrong." I realized his father constantly shits on him, so he has no motivation. Kid ended up getting expelled shortly after for something unrelated. I had an extremely self-absorbed and arrogant student. The only person in real life I've ever heard use the phrase "Do you know who I am?" Apparently he had won some local sports contest and he really wanted to impress this younger student. He harassed every girl in the school. The first conversation I had with his mother, she sniveled, "You do know this is a sports school, right? Not an academics school." Click. I had a student who was a low-level rebel. I taught an elective, but I'm sure he was put in my class because it seemed low effort at the time. He was sulky, had issues with authority, didn't turn in his homework, etc. I dealt with him the same way that I deal with all my kids, and we slowly started to develop some fragile rapport. At parent/teacher conferences, his mom brought him along. He looked trapped and defensive, and she looked irritated. By that point in the year, he was passing my class, so I started off by reviewing his grades and the events that were coming up in my class. She interrupted me near the end to say, yeah, but what is his behavior in class like? How badly is he behaving for you?" Poor kid slides lower in his chair, and I can tell that his mom brought him along as an exercise in shaming her kid. I didn't feel like playing that game, so I brightly laid out every possible positive interaction I had with him during the year, the conversations he had with me about career aspirations, the times he showed up on time to class, whatever I could throw at her. She left still looking irritated, but her kid left looking a little better. Sure, there were things I wished he would improve on, but that's a conversation for me and him to work out, not something to pile on in an evening of lectures from other teachers. I've met a lot of parents of great kids and it totally makes sense that their kid is great because they are super nice and polite and normal. But I know people are here for the horror stories. I taught kindergarten for the first part of my career. My last year in K I had a girl who was possibly the brattiest child I ever met. She had no qualms telling me no when I'd ask her to do something totally reasonable, was mean and nasty to the other kids. Just a total nightmare. At Meet the Teacher night, she came with her mom, despite me asking parents to leave their children at home unless absolutely necessary, and was totally disruptive and noisy, and Mom said nothing. Mom stuck around to ask me a question at the end, and her daughter was covering her mouth as she was trying to speak. The mother just eventually gave up trying to ask me anything. I was so shocked I didn't even know what to do. A kid I had the year before was another hot mess. I had a really small class that year, which never happens in an urban public school, and it was so great for their social development. Except this kid. He didn't want to learn his classmates' names and didn't want to play with them. Fair enough. But he would also interrupt them when it was their turn to talk because he wanted it to be his turn. Everything had to be about him or he'd throw a fit. He did no work and was well behind all of the other kids. I met with the parents about his progress and they just laughed and shrugged. That's just his personality, he's the star. They also didn't make him do any of the extra work I sent him to help him catch up because he didn't feel like it. I was so happy to watch him walk out of my door on the last day of school. There's a boy in my class who hits children and laughs about it, most often with small disturbing smile as the other kid freaks out. We've told his parent repeatedly, and she stands there with her arms crossed looking at us like we should go die. Then she smiles at her son and asks in an overly cheerful voice if he wants to get ice cream / go to the movies / play mini golf, essentially rewarding him for this behavior. It's so fucking infuriating. But it makes sense, because it's right there. As a high school senior, I was a TA for a 5th period 8th grade English class for kids who weren't special education, but were troubled and did not want to learn. Kids who would yell fuck you when the teacher would have a pop quiz and then turn in an empty page. There was one kid who was incredibly hard to deal with. He would get in daily shouting matches with the teacher, he would run out the door when her back was turned and try to scale the fence, things like that. One day, after the class had had a particularly good week, the teacher rewarded them by checking out Princess Mook from the library. I'd never seen the kid so quiet. He was absolutely entranced. And then a character said damn or bled and the teacher freaked out and turned it off. The kid responded by throwing his chair at the whiteboard. He was suspended for a week and his parents were called to pick him up. They answered their house phone, acknowledged that they understood the situation, said they were on their way, but they never came to pick him up. I ended up driving the kid home and he told me that both of the cars in his driveway were his parents' cars. They just didn't bother. The next day, his parents dropped him off at school again, despite the suspension. He sat in the office all day, his parents not responding to calls to pick him up. A parent-teacher meeting was scheduled with the parents, but they didn't show. This happened about 3 times before the teacher gave up on having one. We never actually met the parents face to face, but at that point both the teacher and I understood exactly what kind of parents they were and why the kid was the way he was. I worked as a teaching assistant at a school last year. One 8-year-old kid was incredibly competitive and would threaten other students who were in 2nd or 3rd place in competitions to stay in their place so that he could win something, and he would become incredibly red-faced and stressed. He would literally threaten his peers. He even threatened to kill other students over a competition of who could make this little robot move within taped lines on the floor. He would become completely irrational during competitions, it was crazy. Then his parents came in for school sports day and had a full meltdown when they didn't win the jokey parent race we do at the end of the day. They accused other parents of cheating because they had sports shoes on, whereas other parents had just come from work, so they just did the race barefoot. The dad went as far as demanding a rematch on a more level surface. Other parents just did a funny pose at the start line to make the kids laugh, ran the race and fucking went home. About 14 years ago I was an ESL teacher and had a student who, for lack of a better way to describe him, was like a feral animal. Many of my students were the children of migrant workers who would come and go through the fall and spring, so my class had a sort of revolving door of kids year-round. This student was 15 but didn't have even a basic grasp of social norms, and to make matters worse he couldn't speak English, so many of his peers and teachers would get increasingly frustrated with him as he continually broke social norms like standing too close to people, touching people who didn't want to be touched, and blowing his nose into his hand. After his second week in our school, I requested a conference with his parents and found that he had no parents listed in our student records. I asked him about this and he told me that he was from Honduras and his mom still lived there. When I asked him how he got to the States, he just said that he walked with some other people from his town that his mom sent him with. It turns out that he was living with friends of his mother's friends in their garage in Michigan. He was literally being treated like an animal. I got to know him really well over the next few years and he told me that his life in Honduras was not all that different. His mother raised him alone and they were very, very, very poor. He was left to raise himself and never really went to school up until coming to the States. My wife and I weren't well off ourselves at the time, but we bought him clothes, shoes, and food when he needed them. He became a son to me, and had I been more aware of how social services operated, I would have fought to gain custody of him. He's since moved back to Honduras, but I still keep in contact with him to this day. Edit: since this post has garnered a lot of attention, I'd like to point out that May is National Foster Care Month. Please consider exploring ways that you can support children in care in your area. If you're so moved, please consider becoming a foster parent. In my county alone there is over a 1,000 bed shortage, so kids are often left in overcrowded shelters while they await placement.